Planet Institute.
Welcome to today's episode of R&D Unplugged, a podcast from the Learning Plan Institute dedicated to discussing with researchers on the impact of their work in a simple way. My name is Annalena, I'm your host today. Today's guest is Olga Kokshagina. She's an associate professor in innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Sydney, an adjunct at Monash University and the Learning Plan Institute here in Paris. She's also a co-founder of NINTI, an organization that supports women's health in the workplace. Hi Olga, thanks for being with us today.
Hi there.
So, your research is focusing on the role of collaboration and technology in shaping innovation development and scaling in complex challenges with a strong focus on healthcare and co-design. But before we dive deeper into this, let me ask the following maybe less conventional question. If your research had a theme song, what would it be and why?
Wow. Thanks, Annalena. A hard question to start with. And a few songs came to my mind. And maybe the one somehow that stuck was Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie. Why? Because when we think about this multi-stakeholder collaboration, especially in settings like climate change or food or healthcare, there is an urgent need to change. That's why Under Pressure. And yet we all know how hard it is to integrate those systems, to make them move and actually do it in a systematic and sustainable way.
Okay, nice song though. I really like it. Thanks for sharing with us. So let me come to my first, maybe now serious question. What inspired you to pursue this particular research topic?
I think it comes back to, initially I was trained as an engineer, so kind of being inspired by technology, the way the machines work, trying to understand somehow these complex systems. And the more I think I worked in this field, the more I realized that essentially we actually see that all these choices, the things that we see as our everyday objects, the machines and systems we use are somehow designed by someone. And by someone is the groups of stakeholders, many different individuals creating systems, organizational structures that support and actually make decisions that perhaps appear in a certain way. So that made me kind of being more and more interested in these collaborational settings, organizational structures that actually support and enable this work of co-design by integrating, let's say, perspectives of different individuals, end users, different stakeholder groups.
Okay, so actually coming from engineering, if you would have to place yourself right now in a field, how would you describe it best? Where you're working in right now?
Right now, from the engineering perspective?
Well, not from the engineering perspective, because that's where you're coming from. But now your research field, how would you describe it?
I feel it's pretty much being an ethnographer or a person in the room who is trying to understand why certain people come to certain settings, why they start working together, observing that, but also facilitating that. So trying to enable those type of exchanges and supporting systems to do so.
Okay, super nice. It's really interesting, this transfer from engineering now more on the research side. You've mentioned before when talking about your song Under Pressure, healthcare, food, climate change, all these challenges we are facing right now. So my question now to you is, how does your research contribute to these issues that the world is facing right now?
Kind of almost like a drop in the ocean, because in a way I feel like to be able to make that change, it requires all of us to contribute. What we do at our smaller scale is really try to work at the empirical level with some systems being enabled in the context. Like, for example, the research we do currently with the World Health Organization is really pretty much supporting guideline developers to integrate end user perspective. Let's imagine, for example, a nurse in Zambia who is using guideline evidence, scientific evidence, to be able to administer a certain drug or be able to treat her patients better. So she will use guidelines produced by WHO, by amazing scientists somewhere else, mostly in the northern hemisphere to some extent. So how do we make that connection so that guideline developer and the team working on those guidelines integrate the perspective of those end users dealing with that? So that's been a project we've been working on for a few years now, leading to design principles and design tools that support guideline developers. And this is the project we are doing with Monash University in Australia. Another example, just to give you another hint, is pretty much, for example, a while ago, we looked into cancer treatment pathways here in France and looked into, okay, there is a lot that's happening in terms of clinical innovation, immunotherapies, different ways to support patients who are diagnosed with cancer. But what happens after? Once you're treated, once you're cured, and that's great, like what's the aftercare? Which type of practices of support we need to integrate? And we've been involved in a project looking into which type of support care needs to be integrated. How do we make sure that these pathways integrate the needs of different patients with different perspectives, with different ways of connecting to the service and living in different places? So pretty much how do we restructure cancer care pathways to integrate aftercare and even define what aftercare means in different contexts.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. You mentioned like the implementation of these things. Could you maybe describe a bit more which kind of results are you getting in your research that then help you to kind of give recommendations or implement new things? To maybe then we can imagine better how it comes from the research to the implementation in the end?
Great question. I somehow come from the practice, which I like to call engaged scholarship. There is a body of knowledge coming from the work of Van de Ven, and it's all about being integrated into practice. So you can be embedded in the organizational setting. Sometimes you end up working for a certain organization or alongside with them for 2-3 years. And the idea really is that you do your research through practice. So for me, looking into the research output and also integrating practical outputs come along together, meaning that I would not aim just having a publication out of the projects I engage with, but actually thinking first practically what's in it for people who are involved. Is it practical tools, frameworks, policy recommendations, toolkits that we can actually co-develop together to be able to first help the individuals or enable them to actually continue that work once researchers are not there, and then also use it as an opportunity to understand the systems, to learn from them, and potentially having an academic output as a publication.
Okay, I like what you said, what is actually in for the people who participate. So it's really about making a change for these people and not just doing it for a publication and kind of being done with a project. I really like that thought about the people who are in the project. So what were some key findings of your research and maybe something that also surprised you?
Thinking for a second.
That's okay.
So many thoughts that emerge at the same time. Maybe just to come back to that point of integrating, I think many times when we come with our best expectations to the research projects, sometimes we end up extracting a lot of data and insights from the individuals participating in there, and pretty much thinking, how do we give back and how do we first think about those users who are participating in those projects is a must, just building on the point you shared before. And how do we somehow make sure that it's a design approach for participation in the first place. But just go back to your question of what are some practical results maybe of some projects. I think it depends. We can distinguish between the individual level or organizational level. For some reason, my mind went to the PhD I've done in the semiconductor industry, looking actually at the innovation processes at ST Microelectronics here in France. And what we did, we essentially worked on helping advanced R&D teams to actually think about how do we navigate very uncertain situations of technology being very mature and also markets perhaps that do not exist. And I was fortunate enough to contribute to structuring an innovation process that led to a spin-off that was designed by a company in the field of tactile tools. And the company existed for many years and was bought by a German company afterwards. And that field and that technology somehow is a technology where you can imagine different ways of, for example, sensing what you have on the screen. So that would be one output. Other aspects, like the work I think we are doing with Monash, with WHO, is an interesting example of how do you support guideline developers with the design tools, with the design perspective that can potentially actually lead to have better guidelines that integrate perspectives like lived experience, but also designing things for accessibility, inclusivity, design with empathy. And that potentially can help us change the way we use and design guidelines in the future.
Did any results surprise you or maybe challenge even existing assumptions you had before?
The time it takes. I think we live in the world of where we still see, all of us, we have the KPIs, we have specific outputs we want to get. But what I see most in these collaborative engagements is the experience that matters, the context that matters, and cultural sensitivity that we need to embed in all those contexts that we study. So now, for example, here with LPI, we have some projects in relation to relational well-being. So not looking into these collaborative settings in education, for example, not just from the perspective of what are the outputs, which type of jobs do I get, or how do I publish better, for example, but actually from the experience. And how do we make sure that people who join, they have better relational well-being, better subjective well-being, for example, from different perspectives. And that's where I feel like we're trying to combine more and more this field of, okay, we need to structure those processes, but we need to structure that from the perspective of actually focusing on the experience of individuals. And that's where I see myself surprisingly leaning more and more.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for a long time, even in school, even university, we're grading results. But actually, what's about the experience, the process of learning, and the experiences students do in their learning environment. Let's just maybe go even deeper in this. And how do you make the bridge now between your research and real life? You already mentioned some, also in a company you were working in, but maybe if we stick a bit to this experience instead of result focusing, how can we bridge now these results there, or are there really results yet of research? And how can we bridge it with real life?
Different examples, maybe just let me think of. For me personally, even a while ago with a colleague in Austria, who's based in Austria right now, we looked into digital work, for example. Like, what are the practices of digital work? How managers better help cope their employees to deal with tensions that digital technologies somehow bring into their work environments and their personal lives. I think we've all seen how COVID somehow changed the way we work in some settings. And what I found was interesting in that study is somehow looking into that from the perspective of paradoxical tensions. So we gain a lot by being more connected, being able to work across different time zones. But yet at the same time, we see also the increasing level of stress. Like, we can talk about techno stress, can talk about the issues of attention economy, for example. And we wrote a report on that with the French Digital Council on attention economy, trying to see how different technologies we design today, different platforms, they are designed to better capture attention, to make sure that you stay longer online or you lead to a certain transaction. So kind of making a study to actually realize what are those patterns that can help you, but at the same time also lead to some unintended consequences. And for me, like identifying some strategies that perhaps now anyone can look at the recommendations that are published on the website through this report, but also seeing how, for example, I changed my own way of using digital tools, trying to integrate some routines and practices, but also trying to look into how do you organize your work setting that somehow integrates better, healthier practices of using digital technologies at the same time. So that would be a practical example that somehow led to some recommendations at the policy level, but also more importantly changed even my way of looking into things as well.
That's interesting because I think this is a problem we're all facing. You're connected now all the time. We're reachable all the time. It's really hard to actually deconnect, really. It's fine because all your examples really have the feeling they're on the ground. You work with the people. You really try to get recommendations for everyday lives of people. So maybe, do you have any anecdote or story where your research directly impacted or changed someone's life? You just mentioned yours, adapted a bit, the digital use, but do you have any example of someone else? I know it's a hard one.
Yeah, you can have many anecdotes. Change, I think it's a strong word. Perhaps impacted or intrigued. I guess, yes. None of that is systematically validated. That's for sure. And I mean, these are some examples. But for example, I mean, people contacting you and saying like, look, you, for example, creating awareness around the use of, around even realizing how your attention is captured online, for how long you stay. So I feel like with my students a lot, we discuss those things and I see with them, so it's not personal, but maybe a group level. Because when you start those conversations and you usually even have like different collaborative exercise, you will ask me, okay, can you please tell me how do you think, how many hours do you spend online? And people are like, no, just 3 or 4. And then you tell them, okay, let's take a look at your phones. And then you actually see they are surprised when they look at the statistics. And I had some extreme cases of being like online on TikTok for 10 hours a day.
Wow.
So like creating this awareness, I think, would be one at the group level, which hopefully will lead to different actions and different ways of organizing things. I think that's where I think it's the first level of engagement. And maybe another example, I'm passionate about women's health, so that's why I co-founded Ninti with Fatima Ali. And what we try to really look into there is like, how do we help women in the workplace? And what you see while looking into initially like how technology can help, which technological products we can develop, we actually came to the realization the first thing to do is really creating this awareness and holding this space where we can talk about those issues. And we have lots of positive feedback from many, many individuals who joined those sessions to actually just connect, learn from each other, see how we can support each other. That's where I see the impact at the individual level. I will not name the names. And again, we would need to check that systematically, but that somehow keeps you motivated and helps you get going into those issues as well.
Thank you. I think it's, I like when you said like creating awareness, creating spaces. I think also safe spaces where people can exchange. So that sounds really interesting. Thank you. You mentioned already your students you're working with. So let's pretend now I'm also 20 years old again and I want to change the world for the better. Why should I engage in research, first of all? And why should I choose your specific research topic?
Well, engaging in research, from my perspective, is, let's imagine you're joining a big company. I started my career actually in a big company, IBM, so as a graduate program. And in a way, once you join those type of settings, you have an exciting job, but it's all pretty much defined by your manager, especially if you're at the entry level of your career. So they tell you what to do. Only later, you will actually have the agency to basically decide what you want to work on and actually go deep into understanding certain topics and certain issues. What I love in research is, obviously, sometimes you don't have 100% agency to decide what you're working on, but you have a possibility to influence that. And you also have a possibility to actually understand the topic from so many different perspectives, to actually go deep into that and actually make a change, because you are able to study those systems, take time to understand and actually implement and go all the way through. And I think research somehow helps you do so. And from my own field, I do a lot of design work. And for me, it's the best way to connect to people, because we say, okay, you need to design with empathy, you need to spend time with the end users. It's pretty much being in these organizational settings. Spend your time with them, learn what makes those people, those communities motivated to do what they do, why and how do they do change, because you really realize how many exciting, amazing things are happening all around. And I think that's where become a designer, study and do a PhD in industrial or engineering design or service design. I think there is a lot to do and you'll definitely see the world from a different perspective.
Interesting. Thank you. I think it's always good to have the end user in mind, because why should we develop products that actually have no user in the end? I think it's also frustrating in the process, and really seeing that impact of your own work then with the users who are using it in the end must be really nice.
Exactly. And maybe just to add to that, it is true that if you're designing a radically new technology that will revolutionize the way things are, it is hard to imagine who will be potential end users. And it might take a while before we start to structure the value chains around that, actually integrate those end users and see how they will actually look into that. And the example of that in my head is quantum. It's happening now that we will start to think, okay, what are those end users? How do we integrate them? And how do we develop literacy around what are those technologies for the end users? And even if it's hard to imagine at the very beginning, I think what's important is really to integrate the literacy for those end users to actually help them. And by end users in this case, it's all the citizens. We need to imagine how, and we need to integrate the perspectives for them to understand how those technology works and how they can use that in the future.
Thank you. I think that was a nice end of our podcast. I think that wraps it up perfectly. I'm Annalena Neurohr, your host of today. A huge thank you to our guest, Olga Kokshagina, for sharing her valuable insights and expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And also a big thank you to all our listeners who joined us for today's episode. R&D Unplugged is a Learning Blind Institute podcast. This episode was produced by Annalena Neurohr and Shahab Nastar, with recording by Edouard Picard and editing by Jean-Marc Sauvin. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find all of our podcasts and further information about all our activities on our website at learningplaninstitute.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening and see you for our next episode.
Learning Planet Institute.